Hi, everyone. Before the episode begins, I just want to remind you to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Marlene the Plant Lady and YouTube, Everything Gardening with Marlene Simon. And remember, please, please, please rate and review on iTunes and Spotify. That just helps the podcast get noticed by more people, and then more people will become better gardeners. And that's what we all want. So enjoy the episode.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host, Marlene, and back is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, guest is Robert Pavlis. You know him from so many places. He is a wealth of knowledge. His website, gardenmyths.com. He's pretty much, if there's a garden myth and you want to know if it's true or not, he's the guy, but he's way more than that. His YouTube is Garden Fundamentals, and he writes books like I read books, and his latest book is Microbe Science for Gardeners, and of course, Soil Science for Gardeners, Plant Science for Gardeners, Compost Science for Gardeners, and of course, his two installation garden myths, which I absolutely love. So, Robert, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, thanks very much. Love being here.
And I love that your latest book is Microbes for Gardeners, because that could be quite confusing to gardeners. And when I sort of came up with a list of what topics I wanted to talk about with you, and it really is about microbes, how that corresponds to getting nutrients in your soil, because I know you've seen this myth of, when there's a banana peel or eggshells or anything, you just put it in the soil and magically those nutrients get directly into the ground. And that's not the case. So can you go into, first of all, when you say microbes, what do you mean?
So microbes is a general term. The most important classifications there are bacteria and fungi, and they make up the large volume of microbes. There are also things like protozoas, though, which are larger, and they tend to eat bacteria. There's also algae, which plays a minor role in soil, but they're in the soil too. But it's mostly fungi and bacteria, the two big categories that we're interested in.
And when a lot of times people hear fungi and bacteria, they of course think, oh, that's bad. But no.
That's bad. Yeah, this is the one of the issues that I think we have in gardening is we have this idea that all these things are bad, and it's because we're constantly trying to fight the bad ones. And it goes for bugs too, right? Bugs in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
We're always worried about the bad ones. And we have to realize that 80 to 90% of bugs and microbes are good guys. They're actually helping us garden. They're helping plants. They're helping the whole composting process. They're helping make good soil for us. They're our friends. It's 10% that are bad, and they get a bad rap from us because that's the ones we talk about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them are actually good for us, and we have to learn to sort of embrace them.
Yeah.
The other thing that's important is that usually when we do something for the bad ones, we're also harming the good ones. This is something I see all the time. How do I hurt the bad bugs, but I don't want to hurt the pollinators, right? Because the pollinators are seen as good guys.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that, whether they're microbes or insects. If you're going to hurt one group, you're going to hurt the other group just as much. This bad and good idea is a human thing. It doesn't exist in nature. In nature, they're all living together and coexisting. And anything we do in the garden is going to affect both the good ones and the bad ones at the same time.
100%. So I sort of want to do something where I take 3 different forms of, quote, fertilizer. And if you could go through the process of sort of the breakdown of it. So say the first one is you have lawn clippings. And so that's going to be your green manure. So you're going to, a lot of people know green is a great form of, people think nitrogen. So you have your lawn clippings that you're just going to spread onto your soil. Now, what would the process of breaking down with microbes, and how soon, and I know this is like we all want numbers, how soon is that nitrogen and the nutrients going to get into the soil? But I think people need sort of a baseline to know, because you're always gardening for not, especially your soil, you're always gardening and prepping for the future, not necessarily now. And I think people are sort of misled into, oh, if I apply this now, it's going to help these plants now. And sometimes it does, obviously, but can you go through of like green manure versus our quote organic like fertilizers to synthetic?
Okay. Well, I'm going to clump them a little differently.
Go for it.
All the organic material you can kind of think of the same way.
Okay.
Grass clippings, that banana peel, the compost you produced, all of that is made up of large molecules that degrade slowly. And it's the microbes that are going to degrade that. They break up the large pieces into smaller pieces and smaller and smaller and smaller until they become nutrients. And that process, in a general way, takes about 5 years. Okay, so if I take a banana peel or a grass clipping and I drop it on the ground, it will slowly release nutrients over about a 5-year period. Now, that's a rough number. It's going to depend on climate. It's going to depend on the type of soil you have, the number of microbes you have, and so on. But it's years. It's not weeks and months. So one of the things I like to do when I'm talking about this, I say, okay, let's take a banana peel and we put it right beside your plant. What good does it do for the plant? And the answer is absolutely nothing. That plant will starve to death if it has to rely on that banana peel. And the reason is that although the banana peel contains a lot of nutrients, they're tied up so that plants can't get them. Yep. They're tied up in these large molecules. What happens with the banana peel is that microbes come along and they start chewing it up and digesting it. And over the next 5 years, it slowly releases those nutrients. Now, that's great for long-term planning, long-term soil building. It's really terrible for feeding your tomato plant today because it doesn't get fed. A banana peel, and this applies to all the organic material, whether it's compost or fish heads or fish emulsion or kelp extract, whatever it is, those things are organic molecules, they're large molecules, and they take time to decompose. And that's one of the real benefits of synthetic fertilizer is if I need to feed today, it's quick. I mean, as soon as I put it on the soil and water it in, the nutrients are there for the plant to use, right? But synthetic fertilizer is useless for long-term soil building. It doesn't last in the soil. So even a couple of weeks from now, the nitrogen's gone. It's not feeding the plants anymore. It's not doing anything for us long-term. Whereas the organic matter is, and that's the real value of organic matter. A lot of people look at these two and say, well, geez, one's bad and one's good. And that's not really true. They each have their place. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But for long-term soil building and long-term gardening and healthy plants long-term, the organic is far superior.
Yeah, I think people do hear organic and they think, oh, that's better. And they hear synthetic and that's not better, but it all eventually gets broken down to the same amount. And like you said, if you need to fertilize something now, a synthetic's the way to go because it's going to get into the soil, into the plant much quicker.
Right.
People often over fertilize. How does that affect microbes in the soil? If someone were to just add synthetic fertilizer, or they see something and they think, oh, it's always, because I mean, you get the questions too. Whereas most people think, oh, my plant's not doing well, this, that. It's got to be a nutrient deficiency. Whereas I try to tell them most of the time it's never a nutrient deficiency if it's in the ground. But what can over fertilizing do with synthetics to the microbes or anything?
Well, I'll answer that in a second, but let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
There is a very common myth out there, which, in fact, I just released the video this week, that says that synthetic fertilizer kills microbes.
Okay.
right? And I think this idea comes from the fact that many people know that our farmlands that have been cultivated for a long period of time have lower levels of microbes, and that is true to some extent. And they blame it on the fertilizer. And that is simply not true. And there's a couple key things that people have to understand. The first one is that synthetic fertilizer releases nutrients, the nitrate, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are all the nutrients we talk about that plants need. And organic matter releases the same one. So compost also releases those exact same nutrients. And those nutrients are important for plant growth. Well, guess what? Those nutrients are also important for microbe growth. And in fact, they're important for ourselves to grow. I mean, a large part of what we eat for those nutrients. We need calcium, phosphate, potassium, nitrate, and so on. So all the living organisms benefit when we put synthetic fertilizer on that soil, right? Provided we don't go in excess.
Yeah.
All right. So when we add more fertilizer than we should, then there's a couple things that happen. Initially, we add too much nitrogen, and nitrogen runs away very quickly with water. And so we end up polluting our lakes and rivers because we have nitrogen runoff. The other thing is if the nitrogen gets too high, it can actually kill the bacteria and the fungi. But it also kills our plants. I mean, that's what happens when we over-fertilize our lawn, right? We kill the lawn.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is that it's not the fertilizer that's toxic. Okay, so people say, wow, we added too much fertilizer, it's toxic, so it killed the plant, it killed the microbes. That's actually not what happens. What happens is that we add too much nutrient, too many ions in there, and they actually suck water out of the plants and out of the microbes. It's related to osmosis. So now we're moving water from a plant out, and the plant actually dries up and dehydrates. That's what's killing your lawn when you over-fertilize. It's not the toxicity of the fertilizer. Okay? Now, if we add too much, we will harm things in the soil. We will harm plants, the microbes, and everything. So we don't want to do that.
No, can I interject real quick? Because what you said just was perfect for people who have fertilizer burn. You mentioned the lawn, but people with house plants, people with potted plants, where you over fertilize and you get that brown edge on the leaf. So that was just perfect. I just want to interject and say that.
Yeah, and that's perfectly right. It applies to house plants as well, right? There's a certain limit of fertilizer that is great for the plants because they grow well. We give them too much, and it's harmful for them. But again, it's not so much the toxicity of it; it's this water issue, right?
Yeah.
The other problem that happens in gardens, it has to do with phosphate. And to understand that, it's valuable to understand how nitrogen and phosphate behave differently in the soil. So let's say we take some standard fertilizer, the NPK fertilizer, and we put that on soil and we water it in. What happens? Well, the nitrogen is very soluble and it runs into the soil very quickly along with the water. And it stays there for a couple of weeks. And if we get a heavy rain, it's gone. It's get washed out. The phosphate, on the other hand, is not very soluble. It moves a couple millimeters down in soil every year. Okay? It hangs around. Potassium is kind of halfway between the two. So it does move fairly quickly, but not nearly as quickly as nitrogen. So I come along and I fertilize my garden and I use the right amount of fertilizer, and the nitrogen runs away and the potassium runs deeper in the soil and the phosphate's sitting at the top. Next year I come along and do the same thing, and the year after the same thing. Well, you can see that we have a problem here because we're building up the phosphate. That phosphate amount is staying right where the roots are, and over the years we're adding more and more and more. And in fact, what we're finding is that a lot of gardens now have a phosphate toxicity. There's so much phosphorus in the soil that it's preventing proper plant growth. Right? And this is particularly a problem with raised beds where people add a lot of nutrients. And those nutrients aren't necessarily synthetic fertilizer. compost will do the same thing. If you add too much compost and too much manure, you will create a phosphate toxicity. Okay? It's
Interesting.
not the synthetic parts that's the problem here.
Mhm.
It's the amount of phosphate we add.
And I see, I see on certain forums and stuff where people are planting tomatoes or in the wintertime even where there's, it's cold induced phosphorus deficiency, or the tomatoes are just coming out and you have that red and you have that purple and everyone is saying, add phosphorus, you have a deficiency, you have a deficiency. So, you know, I think it's fundamental of knowing that certain times of year things aren't being picked up. And I'm always telling people it's in the soil. Most likely it's in the soil. It's just not utilizing it. So that's interesting
Yeah.
that there is a phosphorus toxicity going on.
Yeah, phosphorus is an interesting nutrient. So there's lots in the soil. Most soil in North America has plenty of phosphorus. We don't have to add more. The problem is that plants have a hard time getting to it. The amount of what's called available phosphorus, that's phosphorus that's dissolved in the water, is relatively low. And so plants struggle to find enough of it. And at certain times of the year, the plants will have a phosphate deficiency, even though there's lots in the soil,
Mhm.
because it's in the wrong form in the soil. And this is one place where microbes come along, because particularly the fungi, they're very good at getting at that phosphate that's not available to plants and making it into a form, a chemical form that plants can actually use. And bacteria tend to do the same thing. So when we have a lot of microbes around our plant roots, those microbes are actually converting the unusable phosphate to usable phosphate, and plants have an easier time to get it.
Interesting.
That's one of the real benefits of microbes.
Mm-hmm. So you hear also a lot of times when people like, oh, I put down compost or I put down the green manure, and now there's going to be a deficiency in nitrogen because the microbes are using that. What's the actual truth in that, and what's the process of going on there?
Okay, well, to understand that, we got to back up a little bit and understand composting in general. So, why does composting happen? Like, why does that banana peel degrade? Or I have some brown leaves in the fall. How do those brown leaves decompose? Well, microbes come along and they literally eat it. I mean, they don't have mouths and so on, but they digest it and eat it. The problem is that these microbes, just like every other living organism, needs a certain amount of carbon and nitrogen in their diet. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So when these microbes come along with brown leaves, that's a brown. Composters call that brown. And it has very high carbon, very low nitrogen, and there isn't enough nitrogen for bacteria in particular to be able to digest that. Now, banana's a little better, and most kitchen scraps are better. They have the right amount of nitrogen and carbon, and so bacteria are able to eat that. And in fact, the ideal ratio you're heading for is a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25 to 30.
Okay.
And when we're building compost piles, that's how we make it. We mix this until we have that ratio, and then we can get really hot, fast compost, right?
Yeah.
All of that also happens in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So these microbes in the soil, they also need both carbon and nitrogen. And it turns out that nitrogen is almost always the deficient element. Everybody's fighting for nitrogen. The microbes, the fungi, the plants, everybody is short of nitrogen. And it's the nitrogen that keeps more growth from happening. So these guys are fighting with each other to get that. If we have a higher amount of nitrogen, then they're able to decompose things faster, and they will release those other nutrients faster too. So they release the calcium, magnesium, and iron, and all those other things that are in the compost. All right, well, back to your question. I haven't forgot the question.
That's okay.
So now we put some stuff
Uh-huh.
on the soil or in the soil. And there's a concern that because these microbes are going to start digesting it, they're going to rob nitrogen from the plants. And it's true in certain situations. So the first situation we'll look at is if we just lay it on top. Well, it turns out microbes, particularly bacteria, are extremely small. Okay, the ones on the top of the surface who are going to eat this stuff that you've laid on top, they can't reach down very far to get the nitrogen. So they're really not going to bother the nitrogen that's around the roots. So as long as we mulch the material, there's no loss of nitrogen. There's no effect on the plants. Okay. Now, the bacteria still need to find some nitrogen, but they don't get it from very deep, and they don't harm the plants. Now, if we take that same material and we put it down next to the roots, we have a different scenario. Those bacteria still need nitrogen, and now they're able to take nitrogen right next to a root. And so you can actually have a nitrogen deficiency next to your plant, which will harm your plant. So now we have to ask, well, what kind of material are we using here? So it turns out that compost, finished compost, has a ratio of around 25 to 20. So that's pretty good. And microbes can come along and digest the compost without taking too much nitrogen away from the plants, and it doesn't harm the plants. Green material, so your grass clippings that you mentioned, they have excess nitrogen. They're high in nitrogen, so burying those wouldn't be a problem either. Where we have a problem is things that are high in carbon. And the things we're talking about here is hay and straw and wood chips. So you never want to take that material and bury it in the soil. As a mulch, it's fine, it won't harm the plants. But if we bury that and we put too much of that high carbon material in the soil, we will actually rob nitrogen from the plants. Right? So it depends on whether you layer it or bury it, and it depends on what the material is. So it's a partial myth. Some of the time.
And it's funny because you hear people who, now they think it's a must that when you do a raised bed, that at the bottom of it, you put old leaves in it. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's going to make you happy, but that's going to break down and it's going to decrease your soil volume. But it also sounds like maybe, that's something to consider as well, is that the more carbon, less nitrogen in your organic matter that you're putting down, assuming the roots of the plants are going to go there. That's interesting. So it could be that that's one practice that's not the best for a few reasons.
In general, it's not a good idea. I would not some people put wood down there, some people put leaves. You don't want a high carbon material in the bottom of your beds because roots aren't going to do well down there.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. You wonder where that I mean, it just starts somewhere, and then all of a sudden people are just like, they say it like it's just, oh, I'm doing this to aid my plant, and you're like, well, there's really no need to. So say someone is like, oh, I mean, you see these things, you see mycorrhizae touted everywhere, and you see, oh, add this to your soil. Basically not over fertilizing, maybe, that seems like a big one of preventing microbe death, but what are other ways of getting microbes in the soil? I'm assuming they're there if you have a quote sort of healthy soil, but what are some ways gardeners could do to help their soil?
So as sort of a summary of what these microbes do, microbes make healthy soil. They improve cell structure, they release nutrients for plants. We want as many of them in the soil as possible. So how do we get more? And the first thing we do is we don't harm the ones we have. And you harm them by getting rid of what they need. And microbes are just like us. They need air, they need water, and they need food. Those are their three ingredients. In fact, these bacteria and fungi that live in the soil, they don't actually live in the soil. They actually live in the water that surrounds soil particles. If our soil gets too dry, the microbes either die off or they go into a form of hibernation. They go dormant. So keeping moisture in the soil is actually one way you keep that microbe population happy. The second one is air. And the way we get rid of air in soil is by compaction.
Yeah.
So walking over your garden, walking over your lawn, anytime we put pressure on our soil, we compact it, and that reduces the amount of microbes we have because there's less air, they can't breathe, less microbes. It's as simple as that. The third one is food. So we want to feed these microbes. And well, if we're going to feed the microbes, people have come up with all kinds of solutions here. A lot of people say, well, let's put sugar in there, or molasses are two popular ones, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of works because microbes, eat sugar. Sugar is an important food for them. That's where they get their energy from. And in the lab, we feed them sugar to make them grow. I mean, we know they like that. But what happens is that food doesn't hang around, right? So we get this burst of microbes, the population spikes, they eat up all the molasses you added. Suddenly the molasses is gone, so they start dying off. And for a little while, the dead ones get eaten by the live ones, but eventually they just get right back to the original population they had. You really haven't accomplished very much. To feed microbes, we want to do long-term feeding. Right? And the secret to long-term feeding, well, it's that organic matter we discussed at the beginning of the program, right? The compost, the manure, anything that's solid and organic is going to take years to decompose. So as it's decomposing, that's food for microbes, but it's a long-term feed. So the way we create more microbes is that we just keep putting this stuff in the soil. Just keep putting in a couple inches of compost every year, and you will have fabulous soil, and you'll have large amounts of microbes.
Yeah.
Now, you did mention adding them and buying them out of a bottle, and I think that's worth discussing.
Yeah.
So people now sell these microbes and they say, well, geez, your soil is bad because you don't have microbes, so add some. Well, that doesn't work. Okay? And I've actually contacted a number of these manufacturers and I said, send me the science, the study that shows that your product actually works. They don't have any. Okay, they can't send me anything. And it doesn't work. And the reason is this, that our soil has huge amounts of microbes. Okay, if I take a little speck of soil and put it in the palm of my hand, if this is a half decent garden, I've got 1 billion bacteria in that speck of soil. I've got 10 million fungi and fungi spores in that soil. The number of bacteria in soil is staggering. Even if you have crappy soil, it's the worst garden in the neighborhood, you still have huge amounts of microbes. Adding more is not going to give you more. Adding more just means that the new ones you've added have nothing to eat and they die off. Your problem is you don't have enough food for the microbes. And that determines the number you have. Increase the food, decrease compaction, create better soil, and you have more microbes. And we do that by adding organic matter to the soil.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense. I was always dubious of those bags of mycorrhizae because I'm like, what? How is that surviving there? I do want to go back a little bit to your molasses and your sugar because I know you're not a big fan of the compost teas where you aerate and you add the molasses. What if people absolutely love to do that, but they've added organic matter and then they got that great burst of microbes from their compost tea and they add it to their soil that they're adding compost? I mean, people like to do that.
Yeah, they like to do that. And I don't know why they like to do that.
I think it's the brewing process. I think when you see like, oh, I'm adding, people love to buy, I think it's the bubbling and it's the adding the molasses and you're like, here, now I just poured this into my soil and voila, everything's great. But that's like what you're saying is you just created all these microbes right away from compost that you should probably just put in the soil. And then you put them in the soil, and if there's nothing for them to eat, they're just going to die anyway. So it's not even necessarily creating the numbers of microbes. It's better off spending that time getting compost and applying it to your soil so they can naturally multiply in the soil themselves.
Yeah. There is no good scientific evidence to show that adding compost tea to your garden increases the number of microbes in your garden. Now, there are some studies that show compost tea might fight very specific diseases, but you have to start with the right compost and so on. That's not something gardeners should be doing. It's very specific. And most of the time, the scientists have inoculated that compost tea with the right kind of bacteria.
Yeah.
For us average gardeners, we're brewing something and we have no idea what we're brewing. We could have pathogens in there for all we know.
True. Yeah.
What we do know is that when we spread it on the ground, it does not increase the number of microbes in the ground. What you should do is take that original compost and spread it around your garden, and that will work.
Yeah. That just the compost is the answer to everything.
It really is.
Yeah. So a few probably other don'ts that I'm thinking is, people love their weed block, weed fabric, but that's, and then if people are laying rocks over the top of their soil and it's heating up, at what temperature is it detrimental? I mean, obviously, compost needs heat, but at what point are those two bad practices?
So as far as the weed barrier goes, I don't think it should ever be used in a garden. It doesn't keep weeds down, except for the first year or two. It looks really great. After that, soil and organic matter settles on top. That's a perfect bed for weed seeds, and the weeds start growing. Weed roots go down, and they're harder to pull up. If you put this over top of tree roots or roots from bushes, they grow up into it, and you'll damage it when you try to remove this material. It reduces the amount of water that seeps into the soil. There's just nothing good about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you put down 3 inches of wood chips or some other kind of mulch, you will reduce the weeds just as effectively, and in fact, better. And if you do get a weed, it's easy to pull out. So I don't think they should ever be used in the garden.
And that I mentioned rocks just heating up because, I live in where it gets very hot, and people send me pictures, and I know that reflective heat going back onto plants and then the surface roots. But, I imagine there's some then heat radiating down just to the top, a little bit of the soil. And I'm just wondering if that could possibly kill off the microbes as well.
Microbes grow at different temperatures, but they're going to do best at the same temperature that our plant roots like. Okay. And our plant roots like to be cool. So rocks actually do work that way. They keep the heat off the soil, and the top layer of soil does stay cooler.
Okay.
So that helps.
So it helps. Okay. All right.
Yeah. They're not adding any organic matter to the soil. So the soil's not getting better. So that's the downside of rocks.
Yeah.
Now, the other upside is if you're in a fire zone and so on, then rocks near the house are safer than mulch and so on, right? So that's a reason to use rocks. But rocks actually do work, and they're quite a good mulch.
Okay.
Keep the roots cooler. They just don't add anything long term.
Yeah. But some people are like, oh, I want it, the look, or just a lot of times I tell them it's not going to prevent weeds from growing because they find their way through. But and so I do want to talk about one thing that sort of I'll transition with this because I love, and I always add another syllable, allelopathic chemicals that plants emit for usually defense purposes for one thing or another. And a big one you hear is, black walnut, but, there's so many other plants that emit that. Can you explain what allelopathic chemicals are? And 2, do they have an effect on microbes? I'll let you take it from there.
Ooh, that's an interesting question.
I wasn't going to ask you that. I just thought about it. I'm like, we hear them with plants,
Yeah.
but how, I mean, if you don't know, I'll edit this out.
No, I think it's a worthwhile question to ask.
Yeah.
One of the things we have to understand about microbes is that we've talked about them as if we understand what all these microbes do.
Yeah.
The reality is that we've only identified maybe 20% of the species in soil. All right.
Okay.
So 80% of the microbes in soil we know nothing about. And we know very little about the 20% we think we know something about. So a lot of what we're talking about is generalized statements based on a limited amount of information. And I think we have to understand that as we go forwards, we're going to learn a lot of new stuff. And if you like, I have some really new stuff we can talk about. That's interesting. But let's get back to the liliopathic chemicals. So plants can't move. The only way they can fight their neighbors or pests or whatever is to make chemicals. And I think one thing people don't understand is that plants are fantastic chemical manufacturers. They make all kinds of toxic materials. How do you think they keep bugs from eating them?
Mm-hmm.
They make pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
And yet people say, oh, I don't want to eat this because it was maybe sprayed with a pesticide, but this carrot over here is healthy. I'm going to eat it. Well, that carrot is full of pesticides, right? In fact, we know that many of the chemicals plants produce are carcinogens.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Coffee, for instance, is laced with chemicals that you would never eat.
Yeah.
So why do we eat coffee and why do we eat all these plants? Well, there are two things we have to understand. First of all, the level of these chemicals is very low. Okay. And when it comes to toxicity of chemicals, the amount is critical. The second one is that our bodies have developed over a million years to eat this stuff. We can accommodate a certain amount of toxic chemicals and it doesn't harm us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we get more benefit from this plant material than we get harm. So how do these plants fight other plants? Well, one way is they actually produce these chemicals and put it into the soil. And these chemicals keep other plants from either growing or germinating. And there is laboratory evidence that this actually happens, and I'm pretty sure it happens.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take our walnut friend, for instance, it puts up a chemical called juglone into the soil. I looked at this. In fact, it turns out walnuts don't even have juglone in them, which I found quite surprising. But they do have another chemical that, when it's exposed to air, turns into juglone, and it's the juglone that keeps other things from growing.
Okay.
And we can take that into a laboratory, and in a pot we can add some juglone, and it does stop seedlings from growing. We can show that effect. Nobody has ever explained how the juglone in nature actually gets into another plant. We can't figure that out. So we're not even sure the juglone is the problem here. The other thing to understand is that it does seem to harm seedlings, but it doesn't seem to be, let's call it, toxic enough to harm larger plants.
Yeah. So
as long as you're putting more mature plants under walnut trees, they grow just fine. And many plants are not harmed by the walnut.
Yeah, so I mentioned I live in an almond orchard, but right around me is the walnut orchard. And the past 2 years, I've moved my vegetable garden, or some of them, and I had my rows of tomatoes. Closest tomato was probably 5 feet from the trunk of a walnut tree. And I did it as, to be honest, I don't think it was the junglins at all. I think it was more of the shade and probably the water uptake of but it grew really fine. Actually, it was just a little more, less compact than if it had full sun. But yeah, so I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, so tomatoes are, you probably know, is one of the plants that is most sensitive to juglone. But most other things grow just fine there.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's more a case of not enough sun and not enough water. And so things tend not to grow well under trees.
Mm-hmm.
And then we blame the jug loan.
Exactly.
Right? So I'm pretty confident that these chemicals do exist. I'm pretty confident they do affect other plants. It's just not clear how effective this process is in our gardens or in nature.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
There aren't many examples of plants that say, well, don't put this beside this because it won't grow there because of allelopathic chemicals, right? Now, the other question you asked is a good one. So, does this harm microbes? Uh, Probably to some extent. What we have to understand is that in any given soil, there are 30,000 species of bacteria. And they're not all the same. They're all different. Some will be harmed by almost anything,
Mm-hmm.
and others actually benefit from it. So a classic example is Roundup. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people think, oh, you put Roundup on the soil and it kills everything.
Yeah.
There are bacteria that eat Roundup. There are bacteria that eat an oil spill. So if you throw a bunch of oil on the ground, which we think it would be terrible for bacteria, there are bacteria there who say, hey, it's mealtime. Let's go eat this stuff.
Yeah.
We're having a party, right? So there's a wide range of different types of microbes, and there's always some going to be harmed and some not, and some don't care. And so, sorry.
Nope. Was that you? You're back.
Yeah, that was me. I just have a phone ringing.
Oh, I interrupted. Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever we talk about the effect on microbes, I think it's important to understand that,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, some will be harmed, some won't, and there's shifts in population, right? We harm one group, the other group has more space, more food, they grow better. And quite honestly, we don't understand very much about these populations
No.
yet. This is all new science.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But almost certainly anything we do to the garden harms something.
Yeah. No, I mean, these are two topics, like you said, there's no labels and we only hear about the walnuts really with that allelopathic chemical, but we know they're there, and it's such an unresearched area. And I know, some professors on campus are doing more of the chemicals that are emitted when insects eat them, because of course that's going to help, that's all about research going into crop production and
Right.
stuff. But as far as what the plants produced to ward off other plants, it hasn't been researched that much. And then yes, also we're using microbes as this one big umbrella term when you mentioned how many are in just one teaspoon, that there's so many of them. So yeah, I mean, it was sort of a very blanket statement saying, oh, do they harm the microbes? Because they are doing, I think, research on toxic waste dumps and what algae and what bacteria could treat them. And so yeah, it's not across the board a yes or a no, but it is something that I think would be very fascinating if they did more research on.
Mhm.
Oh.
Yeah, they just have to find some money for that
Exactly.
research.
So, and I mean, there is money to be had in, if you could clean up toxic waste dumps, quote, naturally. Of course, what do you do with the products that, if they break them down if they break them down? It's sort of like the whole, like, don't, what is it? The roly-polies, they're heavy metal collectors, but it only
Right.
matters if you get them out of your garden or something like,
That's right. Yeah. There is some really interesting research looking at how bacteria digest plastics,
Mm.
right? So what we want to do is invent plastics that degrade faster in the environment. And so we're finding certain types of plastic now and certain types of bacteria that will digest the plastic. So it becomes less of an environmental problem. And that's particularly interesting when we're talking about microplastics, right? Little particles of plastic that are everywhere now. If we can create plastics that are essentially naturally biodegradable by bacteria, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. I do want to circle back to the fertilizing real quick. I realize, so this time of year, you're probably going to get the same questions as me. And I don't know how many people grow citrus up where you're at, but citrus is just so, even people who don't garden, if they have citrus and everything's turning yellow, and I say, just wait, once it starts, picking up nitrogen, of course, there could be a lack of nitrogen, especially if we have heavy rains. But can you talk about the difference real quick from foliar feeding to, say, doing a synthetic fertilizer?
Okay, so foliar feeding is the process where we take our fertilizer, mix up into a liquid, and spray it on the actual leaves. And the story goes that, well, it's right next to where it's needed. It's right at the leaves. The leaves will absorb it, and away we go. We have healthy plants. And that's sort of true. So the first question you have to ask is, well, do leaves actually absorb these chemicals? Because, of course, leaves are designed not to let stuff in and out, right? They have a skin on them and so on. Well, it turns out that these nutrients are absorbed by leaves. They don't go into the main large pores of the leaves, but they do go through micropores in the leaves. And so that part of it works. If I take an iron spray and I put it on a leaf, those yellow leaves will tend to green up because they're getting more iron. But there's a catch to this. The amount that leaves can absorb is quite small. And so we have to go back to all these nutrients that plants need. Plants need a small amount of iron, and they can get some of that through their leaves. But when we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, those are the macronutrients. Plants need huge amounts of those. There is no way we'll ever give the plant enough of those with foliar sprays. The leaves are just functionally not able to absorb enough. Those have to come from the roots. So in general, the recommendation is this. If you have a plant that's deficient in a nutrient and you know what that is, and you want to spray the leaves as sort of a Band-Aid, a quick solution, you spray the leaves, it fixes the problem for a little while, but the real fix is to get that nutrient in the soil. That way the plant can absorb it properly. So foliar spraying is not a replacement for fertilizing, but it can be used as kind of an emergency way of getting certain nutrients into plants.
Yeah. And then you mentioned iron, and generally that's because we have iron, but it's bound up in a pH issue. So
yes,
that could be one way of bypassing having to deal with the pH issue is foliar feed. But then again, it's just don't plant the plant.
Well, that's my recommendation usually, but gardeners, including myself, don't listen to that all the time.
Exactly. So, and that's where people run into problems where they keep adding it to the soil because they say, well, then it must be lacking in the soil. And one of the charts that I show during a talk is that Mulder's chart, where it shows what happens when you increase a nutrient or add too much of a nutrient to the soil, how it binds up another one. And so it's not like, so I think we're so used to taking vitamins, and if we overtake something, we sort of just go, oh, our kidneys take care of it and flush it out. But with soils, it can mess with the uptake and of the other nutrients, so you could be doing a lot more harm just by adding it to the soil.
Yeah, one of the myths that floats around a lot is this idea of we'll give you a chart of different leaves, and there's different colors on the leaves and so on. And by looking at a leaf, you can tell what your nutrient deficiency is. That's complete myth. In fact, a leaf that's yellow, so we have chlorosis taking place. In my Garden Myths book, I think I came up with like 12 reasons why you might have yellow leaves.
Yeah.
Only one of them is an iron deficiency. And as you said, you might have lots of iron in the soil, but if it's too alkaline, the plants can't get the iron. So it's not an iron deficiency, it's a pH problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And a lot of pH problems also revolve around watering issues. So sometimes it's a watering issue that causes the plant to be unable to pick up the nutrient and so on. You cannot tell a nutrient deficiency by looking at the plant. The only way you can tell that is to have the soil tested.
Yeah. So I guess I have to. So I usually tell people, okay, it could be nitrogen deficiency. I always say could be a lot of different, like you mentioned, the yellowing, all over yellow, possibly lack of nitrogen. The iron chlorosis, depending on the plant, if it's like a gardenia, and I know we have a pH of, 8, I'm like, okay, possibly iron chlorosis. But when you start getting into the, oh my God, magnesium, because everyone loves their Epsom salts, it's like, forget it. I may have seen magnesium deficiency once, but I can't certainly say it because it's, it's really hard to tell. And then you could say, oh, you have phosphorus deficiency because the plant leaves are turning red. Well, it could be getting into fall and losing its chlorophyll or, so I only briefly say nitrogen, maybe iron chlorosis. Those are the two.
Yeah, iron is kind of a safe one because,
Mhm.
as I said before, iron is almost always deficient.
Mhm.
It's the thing that's keeping our plants from growing more, and they can almost always benefit from more nitrogen. But you do have to be careful how much you
Yeah.
add. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
And when people are like, oh, I think I have a lack of calcium, like, no, you wouldn't have any plants growing. They would be melted. Uh,
yeah,
so yeah,
yeah.
it's,
Magnesium is almost never a deficiency in
yeah.
North America.
Yeah. I can't say I've ever seen it. I know what quote, like you said, if you're seeing a picture that I'm looking up and it's like, oh, this is magnesium deficiency. Um, if it's coming from a university research, I'm like, okay, but then if it's on a tomato, how does that then translate to something on citrus or translate onto something else? And so
Right.
almost always I'm like, no, if it's in the ground, it's not going to be a nutrient deficiency, except for, like I said, possibly nitrogen, um,
Mm.
and then iron.
Yeah, the one type of soil that does show some of these deficiencies is peat bogs or peat soil.
Mm.
So this is soil that's very acidic.
Hmm.
The peat that's accumulated is very low in nutrients. There's not a lot of minerals in there,
Yeah.
and that soil can show all kinds of magnesium or calcium deficiencies. But soil that has a lot of clay and sand in it,
Yeah.
almost never deficient in
Yeah.
magnesium.
Yeah. And then there's some, like, I thought instead of peat, you were going to say sand, because then, like, people who grow proteas, like in Australia, because I don't know if this is a myth, but they don't like too much phosphorus. And so sandy soils tend to have less.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting that there are quite a few plant species from Australia that can't take high phosphorus.
Yeah. And is that because
Um,
sandy soils lack it and that's where they're growing?
I suspect that's it, right?
Okay.
Over
Mhm.
the eons, those plants have developed to work. Well, they develop two ways. One is to live in an area that has low phosphorus,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't be surprised if they also have very strong mycorrhizal fungi connections,
Yeah.
because mycorrhizal fungi are much better at getting phosphate.
Hmm.
And I would guess that those plants have developed to rely really heavily on those fungi.
Okay. That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any money in that research. I don't think there's a PhD program in protea mycorrhizal relationships, maybe. But yeah, so no, so it's all these little intricacies that, goes to show that, everything, the climate, but then of course the soil and your type of soil really relates to these microbes in the plants, and how you fertilize is a huge one with your type of soil as well. Um,
Mm.
I don't want to keep you any longer because I know we had some technical snafus early on, but I do want to mention that you have finally your own podcast, and it's called Garden Fundamentals, which is the name of your YouTube channel. And you have one out right now, one episode. So maybe by the time we post this, you'll have another one. But right now you can find it on Spotify and hopefully Apple, but I'm sure it'll also be on your website, which is gardenmyths.com.
Eventually.
Actually, I have a feeling you'll get it up there pretty quick. And then your latest book, and I'm correct that your latest book is Microbe Science for Gardeners.
Yes,
yes.
that's the one out right now. Yes.
Yes. And then the Soil Science for Gardeners, which, it's all goes hand in hand there. And then you have Plant Science for Gardeners and Compost Science for Gardeners, which is, we talked a lot about compost. And then, of course, your 2 Garden Myths book. Are you going to come out with a 3rd Garden Myths book?
Well, I've been planning that for many years now, but my editor keeps asking me to write more books. So once I'm finished writing the books he wants, then I may go back and publish book 3, Garden Myths.
Because with the onslaught of TikTok and Instagram, holy moly, I have students come up to me and tell me once, because I'm not on TikTok, and these, you need a 3rd book. People need some.
Well,
people need
I
more
need
science.
5 books.
Yes.
My Garden Myths website has some like 600 posts on myths.
Oh my God.
And some myths have multiple, or some posts have multiple myths.
Oh my gosh.
I have over 300 myths that I haven't written up yet.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So basically you could just do a whole series of those, but the other ones are so important, but I'm glad you're doing a podcast. I'm a podcast listener, not so much YouTube, because I'm probably because I can't focus on just one thing. So I have to be doing something while I'm listening. But so much information told in a way that if you love science, it's great. If you don't love science, it's great, but you get the message across. And these are important things for gardening. I mean, we're talking about soil. And if you ask any gardener, or any gardener gives advice to someone, it's soil, 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 because that literally is the building block of your garden. And so many things could go wrong. But yeah, thank you. This is great. And I'll have all your contact information on the show notes. So until next time, everyone, happy gardening.